great Southern Ocean, where the power of nature once overpowered man's desire for discovery. Survivors of this ocean of fury faced another barrier, a formidable barrier of ice. Further south still, vast fields of moving sea ice lay in wait to grip and crush flimsy wooden ships. But luck favored a few. The ice yielded, and finally the way lay clear to the last continent, Antarctica. On the 24th of January 1895, a landing took place on the Antarctic coast. It was perhaps as significant as Christopher Columbus's landing in North America. It's not known who was first ashore. Was it whaler Henrik Bull or one of his crew? The only witnesses were the startled Adelie penguins. But 3 years later, one of those first footers came back. A young Norwegian, Carsten Borchgrevink, returned to lead Antarctica's first land-based expedition of discovery. They overwintered at Cape Adare in a wooden cabin which has survived a century of storms. It sits in the midst of one of the largest Adelie penguin colonies in Antarctica. Everything was new, and everything, including penguins, was studied by the mainly Norwegian scientists working under a British flag. The party achieved a great deal and ventured further south than any other human beings. Though Borchgrevink himself was a less than able leader, his successful pioneering expedition blazed a trail for a century of icebound discovery. Antarctica means anti or opposite Arctos, the Arctic constellation of the Bear. It was named by the first Antarctic explorer, Aristotle, the Greek philosopher. He explored the idea of a southern continent. But an idea it remained for 2,000 years as nations set about discovering other continents. The first true Antarctic explorer was Captain James Cook. In 1770, on one of the greatest voyages of all time, he circumnavigated the pack ice, but saw no land. He was certain that the icebergs came from land-based glaciers and that the intense cold radiated from a vast frozen land. He concluded whatever was there wasn't worth the having. The risk and dangers were too great. 50 years later, 2 ships of the Imperial Russian Navy made a closer circumnavigation. Commander Thaddeus Bellingshausen could well have been the first to view Antarctica. However, that honor could well belong to one of the many sealers whose bloody business took them well south from South America. So intense was the rivalry between gangs that killing grounds became closely guarded secrets, and few logs and charts were produced. As the fur seal colonies diminished, sealers were driven further and further south by the lust for skins, worth a fortune in Europe. Then elephant seals were taken for their blubber, which was rendered into oil in an era before petroleum. An early landing probably took place below South America on the Antarctic Peninsula, a long finger of mountains outside the Antarctic Circle.
Welcome to the Antarctic continent. Welcome to Antarctica. Right here at Gonzales Videla, this is the site of the...
Tourists now make regular landings here. They at least know what to expect. In the 19th century, the first reports of what Antarctica had to offer bitterly disappointed the waiting world. It was bleak and treeless, and there were no riches to be had, at least on land. But offshore, there were vast profits to be made for those brave or foolish enough for the chase. Antarctic whaling is similar to the story of sealing. Having plundered Northern Hemisphere stocks, the whalers were driven further and further south, and they pursued their quarry with the utmost vigor. A speared bull-sperm whale could be more than a match for its pursuers. He could tow a small flotilla of longboats at more than 10 knots for 24 hours. And then turn to avenge himself. Few whales escaped. They were cut down and stripped for the many valuable products their bodies contained. But it was whalers who kept alive an interest in Antarctic waters when others looked for profit elsewhere. In 1872, HMS Challenger, commanded by Sir George Nares, brought science to Antarctic waters. The expedition to learn everything about the sea made the first inventory of its natural and geographic features. Scientists brought specimens aboard, where they were studied in state-of-the-art Victorian laboratories. Perhaps Challenger's greatest discovery was made during dredging. They caught and analyzed a superabundance of krill. Masses of these shrimp-like creatures covered tens, if not hundreds of square kilometers of Antarctic surface waters. They deduced that krill is important to all Antarctic life. And it makes Antarctic waters some of the richest on our planet. And wherever there's life, the eternal drama of hunter and the hunted is enacted. It was in 1895 that the International Geographical Congress first seriously promoted Antarctic exploration. Gerlache Strait, to the west of the Antarctic Peninsula, is named after Adrien de Gerlache, the leader of the 1898 Belgian National Expedition. Their ship Belgica was sturdy, but relationships on board were fragile. The multinational crew had no common language. Geologist Akhtovsky accused Gerlache of not permitting scientists sufficient time ashore. they had to be content sampling the rich polar waters. Gerlache was also accused of allowing Belgica to become trapped in sea ice. For 13 months, the movement of ice and fear of the unknown terrified the crew. Men trudged around their ship on a madhouse promenade to escape the twin torments of claustrophobia and depression. Watching and learning from these events was Belgica's mate, Roald Amundsen, who a decade later would lead a highly successful expedition to Antarctica. The next Antarctic visitor was Otto Nordenskjöld, who led a Swedish expedition south. They began collecting fossils that were captive in the rock on the Antarctic peninsula. A major discovery were these fossil leaves. They proved that Antarctica hadn't always been locked in the grip of ice. Millions of years ago, the now bleak and windswept valleys had been forested and echoed to the sound of birdsong and the play of gentle breezes. But the leader, Nordenskjöld, saw something more in these Antarctic fossils. He believed they pointed to Antarctica having been joined to South America sometime in its geological past. A bizarre suggestion at the time, but this gifted geologist was later proved to be correct. Disaster struck Nordenskjöld's ship. While returning to collect the party at the end of summer, it was crushed by pack ice and sank 40 kilometers from land. It took the crew 2 weeks to struggle ashore over ice and water. What followed were several chapters in a most remarkable story of survival through 2 Antarctic winters before the eventual safe return of all expedition members. News of Nordenskjöld's shipwreck inspired the French, led by Jean-Baptiste Charcot, to send the first of 2 Antarctic expeditions. On both occasions, his ships were nearly wrecked. In avoiding a collision with an iceberg, the Pourquoi Pas hit a submerged rock and limped back to South America for repairs. But Charcot's work added hugely to Antarctic knowledge, providing a wealth of research, photographs, specimens, and 2,000 kilometers of newly explored coastline. Charcot named Le Maire Channel. The channel is a highway of history, used by explorers, whalers, and now tourists. By 1910, the Antarctic Peninsula had been thoroughly explored. But what lay further south? On the other side of the continent, discovery was taking place in an area bordered by the Ross Sea. This would be the gateway to the heart of Antarctica. In 1840, 3 expeditions came south following the readings of a peculiar instrument called a dip compass. The closeness of its needle to the vertical measured the closeness to the South Magnetic Pole. Englishman James Clark Ross came closest to finding this elusive point. The dip compass led Ross's ships to battle storm and pack ice in the sea that now bears his name. Having broken through, Ross realized that the magnetic pole lay beyond mountains to the west. He proceeded south, seeking a cape to take him westward. But what he saw next astonished everybody. It was a stupendous volcanic mountain in a high state of activity. He named it Erebus in honor of his worthy little ship. Beneath modern Mount Erebus is New Zealand's Scott Base, and nearby the biggest base in Antarctica, the United States McMurdo Station. In summer, it's home for 1,000 logistics staff and scientists with daily flights to the South Geographic Pole, the real South Pole, which 90 years ago obsessed a generation of explorers. Modern McMurdo would have seemed a crazy dream to the first group that attempted to travel to the South Pole. Near McMurdo Station stands Discovery Hut, erected in 1901 for the first polar expedition of an Englishman, Robert Falcon Scott. His expedition came south to stake a claim for the Empire, have a crack at the pole, and undertake some science. Scott himself became Antarctica's first aeronaut. In a tethered balloon inflated with hydrogen, he ascended more than 200 meters. What he saw was just part of the great floating Ross Ice Shelf, which is in total an area as great as France and 20 to 30 meters thick. It's fed by the many glaciers that surround it, but what they asked fed those glaciers. Scott organized two parties to climb the glacier, named for expedition geologist Hartley Farrar. The Farrar Glacier led Scott's party up 3,000 meters, where they discovered a vast plateau of ice. Scott wrote, "Before us lay the unknown. What fascination lies in that word?" The plateau contains most of the world's fresh water and is the source of the 30 giant glaciers which flow down to the Ross Ice Shelf. Scott decided that this would be his route to the pole. On the 2nd of November 1902, Scott and two companions set off. After 4.5 months and 800 kilometers, they returned, beaten by fatigue and scurvy. To the left of Scott and Dr. Wilson is an unrecognizable Ernest Shackleton, who would return 4 years later to lead another polar expedition. Shackleton's base was at nearby Cape Royds. It was home for 20 men, and the 6 months of dark winter passed in moderate comfort and relaxed preparation for spring. The return of the light brought the sleeping continent to life in a soft glow of perishing cold. It was now time for two important expeditions to set off from the little hut. One was led by Australian Dr. Edgeworth David on another attempt to locate the South Magnetic Pole. His party of 3 drove the first motor car in Antarctica. They used it to pull their sledge, which it did for the first 24 kilometers before it overheated. At this point, they abandoned the vehicle and began man-hauling the 300-kilogram sledge toward the South Magnetic Pole that lay many hundreds of kilometers somewhere to the northwest. Shackleton's party set off south toward the true South Geographic Pole. They used Manchurian ponies to haul sledges across the ice shelf. After a month, Shackleton and Deputy Frank Wild realized that the only way to the pole lay over the 3,000-meter high barrier of the Trans-Antarctic Mountains that curved in front of them. It must have been a daunting prospect. For their route, they chose and named the 40-kilometer-wide Beardmore Glacier and began the struggle up onto the icy vastness of the polar plateau. Food became an obsession. At strategic camps, exhausted ponies were shot either to be eaten there or the meat stashed for the return journey. Men added pony maize to their own meager rations. Finally, on the 9th of January, just 180 kilometers from the pole, Shackleton called a halt. He had to, if they were to get back alive. It was an agonizing decision for the man everyone knew as the boss. 1 week later, the other party struggled to their goal on the featureless plateau. The Australian team of Dr. Edgeworth David, Alistair Mackay and Douglas Mawson stood at the South Magnetic Pole. However, that most elusive of prizes, the South Geographic Pole, remained unclaimed. But not for long. In 1910, Captain Robin Scott was icebound once again. Crowds gathered in New Zealand to wish him and his crew good luck. Though well prepared for its scientific work, the main purpose was to bag the pole for Britain. In this regard, the British were to prove amateurs. At the same time, in Norway, there was a secret push to the pole. The ship Fram was being prepared by leader Roald Amundsen for an expedition north. His crew thought it strange to be shipping Arctic dogs to the Arctic, but once at sea, Amundsen told them of his real plan. The recent conquest of the North Pole made him determined to be the first to the South Pole. Both parties appeared in the Ross Sea, January 1911. At Cape Evans, Scott's Manchurian ponies were unloaded. Like Shackleton, he was to find ponies inadequate as sledge pullers. They would sink into the soft snow and suffer badly in the Antarctic blizzards. Despite their hardiness and strength, Scott's dogs were used only for laying food depots. 600 kilometers to the west and 100 kilometers closer to the pole, Amundsen's crew erected their hut, underground storage, even a sauna bath for relaxation during the long winter ahead. At Scott's base, photographer Herbert Ponting captured scenes of another side of polar exploration. Their wintering over hut at Cape Evans still stands. Here, Scott celebrated his 42nd birthday. It would be his last. At midwinter, Scott gave permission for a bizarre journey. A party of 3, led by naturalist Edward Wilson, would journey 200 kilometers into the frozen darkness to collect eggs. They traveled for 2.5 weeks in temperatures reaching below -60 degrees to reach Cape Crozier. Here they observed one of nature's wonders. Male emperor penguins in the middle of the polar night, each cradling an egg between feet and warm belly. The 3 men collected the eggs needed by science and repeated their tortuous trek. Apsley Cherry Gerard wrote an account of their ordeal, calling it the worst journey in the world. Bitter disappointment awaited leader Edward Wilson. The eggs he collected failed to prove his theory of a link between birds and reptiles. But he was successful at being the first to describe the extraordinary winter nesting behavior of these most polar of penguins, the emperor penguins. On the 19th of October, 1911, Amundsen's party of 5 began their polar assault. 4 sledges, each pulled by 13 dogs. Some dogs would not return. They would be killed for food. A week later, Scott's party set off with the latest in technological innovations. The tractor proved an expensive waste of time and failed in its task of laying food depots. Scott, a Royal Navy officer, based his polar planning on naval systems. Such systems were unsuited to Antarctic conditions. The race was underway. Neither group aware of the other's start time or route. But such is the world's fascination with these polar odysseys that in recent times others have been drawn to reenact them. In 1986, a party led by Robert Swan set off in the footsteps of Scott. Following his route, and man-hauling sledges as Scott did. In 1991, a Norwegian party led by the Mudra brothers came to the pole with dogs, like their countrymen 80 years earlier. Amundsen raced ahead of Scott up and onto the plateau. His years of polar experience, research and detailed planning was paying off. Meanwhile, the British party were man-hauling across the ice barrier. The last of Scott's ponies was shot at the foot of the Beardmore Glacier. Some of his men actually looked forward to man-hauling sledges for 500 kilometers. At the last moment, Scott added another man to their team of 4. It was a critical error, for it meant less tent space, less fuel, and less food. The English diet consisted of pemmican, a minced concoction of meat and fat which they made into a soup called hoosh with crushed biscuits. Their only other food was cocoa, sugar, butter and tea. It was simply inadequate. Their bodies desperately needed vitamins. Some came from the slaughtered ponies. But the meat was not enough to ward off scurvy, a vitamin C deficiency disease. Scott didn't know what modern explorers know, that scurvy is a killer that accompanies an ill-fed expedition. Dogs were the secret of Amundsen's success. On less than a kilogram of food a day, they powered the Norwegians on towards the South Pole. As they got closer, tension grew. Had Scott won the race and the honors? Today, an American flag welcomes visitors to the Amundsen-Scott base at the South Pole. But on December the 14th, 1911, only one flag flew. It was Norwegian. Scott and his party were still struggling up the Beardmore Glacier, repeating Shackleton's earlier route. It may have been more manly and heroic to haul sledges, but with an inadequate diet, it was suicidal. After 58 days and 850 kilometers behind them, they finally reached the top of the glacier. But another 500 kilometers remained to their goal. The Mudra brothers with cameraman Ødegaard used parachutes on their return from the pole. Amundsen set sails on his sledges. Both took advantage of the winds that blow from the pole out to the coast. 26 days later, Scott reached the South Pole to be met by the flags left by Amundsen. He wrote, "My God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have labored to it without the reward of priority. Now for the run home, a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it." Scott ordered a day's diversion to collect rock specimens from the Transantarctic mountains, adding 15 kilograms to the sledge weight. This diversion would cost them dearly. On the 29th of March, just 18 kilometers from their food depot, Scott and his 2 remaining companions made their final camp. We are getting weaker and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I don't think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people. Those in Scott's footsteps also suffered misfortune. Their support ship became firmly wedged by sea ice, and almost at the same time that the trio made it to the pole, the ship was overcome by the crushing pressure of ice. Antarctica is a truly fierce place, and the same winds that sped the Norwegians back from the pole very nearly destroyed the hopes of the 1911 Australian expedition. It was led by Douglas Mawson, a pioneer of the South Magnetic Pole. The expedition based themselves at Commonwealth Bay, directly south of Australia. Mawson's team were experiencing the power of katabatic winds that rush off the polar plateau. His base was well named the home of the blizzard. Mawson sent an expedition to explore to the west, while he, Mertz and Ninnis pushed out to the east. Tragedy struck when Ninnis plunged to his death into a crevasse, taking dogs, food, and most of the camping equipment with him. Sheer exhaustion was to claim Mertz and the remaining dogs, leaving Mawson on his own 100 kilometers from the base. The rescue party of 4 that went out in search of their leader included photographer and Antarctic veteran Frank Hurley.
Through the blinding snowdrift, he ran practically straight into a mound with a black speck on the top of it. Taking this speck down, it was a bag of food that had been left by Hodgman, McLean, and myself, who had been sent out to search for the overdue party. The irony of fate was that we had left that spot only 2 hours before Dr. Mawson reached it. We were then only 2 miles away. But in the blinding snowdrift, of course, all observation was cut down to a few yards. Now, it's interesting to note that that solitary figure struggling along across the plateau took 32 days on his own, a feat that has never been performed by any other man. This gives you some idea of the caliber of our early explorers and the reason of the outstanding success of those early expeditions.
In 1929, a new era began, the mechanized era. Richard Byrd brought the United States and the aeroplane to Antarctica. From a base called Little America, Byrd set out to be the first to fly to the South Pole. Heavily laden with fuel and food, the plane labored to clear the towering Transantarctic mountains. They intended to follow Amundsen's route up the Axel Heiberg Glacier, but found the rate of ascent too steep. Byrd then ordered vital supplies to be jettisoned, and with engines screaming, they just cleared the mountains. Having navigated the exact position of the pole, an American flag was dropped. Amundsen's journey had taken a grueling 3 months. Byrd's took 15 hours. He returned to New York and a hero's welcome. America had established a strong presence on the ice, a presence made possible by Richard Byrd and the aeroplane. Later, aircraft were catapulted from ships. In this way, Germany relaunched its Antarctic presence before World War II. Pilots surveyed over 250,000 square kilometers of unseen land, dropping metal swastikas to mark the boundaries of their survey. A lack of ground confirmation of their photographs rendered their maps less than useful. But Germany had ushered in a new era of Antarctic exploration: politics. Britain countered possible German presence by establishing the first permanent base on the Antarctic mainland at Port Lockroy. After World War II, the nature of discovery continued to change. Most expeditions would now be government-sponsored. In 1946, Admiral Byrd became icebound once again. This time, he led the largest expedition ever to Antarctica. 13 ships, 5,000 men, and 23 aircraft. Operation High Jump staked claim to nearly 4 million square kilometers of frozen continent. Both Operation High Jump and Operation Windmill a year later were strategic exercises. They were for Arctic training and to counter possible territorial claims of other nations. And there were claims. The first head of state to visit Antarctica was Chilean President Gabriel Videla in 1948. By claiming the Antarctic Peninsula, Chile upset Britain and Argentina, who thought they owned the same territory. By the 1950s, a vast tract of Antarctica had been claimed not just by Chile, but by a whole group of nations. Forces of nationalism stood set to erupt into armed conflict, and would have had it not been for the events of 1957, events which marked a turning point in Antarctic history. In 1957, the Trans-Antarctic Expedition completed a crossing of the continent that was first attempted 40 years earlier. It began when the ship Endurance came south into the Weddell Sea. It was leader Ernest Shackleton's dream to make this journey, which he described as the last great adventure. At considerable risk to his own safety, cameraman Frank Hurley recorded the struggle of Endurance as it forced its way toward a landing place. But a landing was not to be. Firmly gripped by ice, no amount of effort would free the ship. Shackleton had no option but to prepare Endurance and crew for a winter locked in ice. The following spring brought huge ice pressure, more than the gallant ship could take. Among the wreckage and rigging of Endurance lay Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica. A dream that was finally realized by the 1957 British Trans-Antarctic Expedition. It was led by Sir Vivian Fuchs.
I mean, I knew a number of the Shackleton people and the Scott people. And several of them have told me that Scott for planning, Shackleton in emergency. I mean, this is the sort of difference between the characters. I don't think that Shackleton was an ideal planner of an expedition, but once he was there and he got a problem, he dealt with it better than most people could.
Fuchs' supplies of fuel and equipment were laid out in depots from the other side of the continent by a group of New Zealanders driving modified farm tractors. Leader of this provisioning party was the conqueror of Mount Everest, Sir Edmund Hillary.
We sort of approached expeditions a little bit the Shackleton way. We didn't always have the best equipment in the world. We were often taking considerable risks, going into areas which were unknown and all the rest of it. But I think we were basically, we had adequate food, but we were prepared to give things a go. So in a way, he was a sort of almost a father figure from the past as far as we were concerned.
Fuchs had a scientific objective. His aim was to build up a profile of the continent buried far beneath the ice. Every 30 kilometers, the snowcats halted and listening equipment was set up. Receivers were laid out to listen for the aftershocks of the explosions as they bounced off the bedrock far below. The continent that Fuchs finally revealed showed several huge mountain ranges far beneath the ice cap, with a broad valley under the South Pole itself. But they found that the ice cap is not a smooth-surfaced plateau. It's a vast minefield of deep crevasses, and most are impossible to detect.
And of course, it isn't everybody who understands that when we talk of crevasses, they're bridged and you can't see them. So you have an area where you suddenly find you're beginning to break a hole. A lot of these bridges, you can get one over and the next one can break it.
They caused long delays and exhausting work, as each had to be bridged with ladders to support the heavy tracks of the snowcat. Meanwhile, Hillary was also in crevasse country. But the lighter tractors were much easier to extricate. The expedition had both tractor power and dog power. Dog teams helped in route finding through the crevasses. In 1957, dogs still played an important role in icebound discovery.
I mean, I've driven some thousands of miles with dogs, and they are extremely efficient form of travel. They don't have the same trouble with crevasses. If you have a good team, you have a leader who, once you set him a course, he will hold to it and needs very little correction.
Go on, dog!
But by the 1990s, treaty nations decided that all dogs were to be removed from the continent. It seems they no longer have a place here.
You have a tractor and it breaks down, you've got to send another one or an aeroplane or something to get it out. If you have a dog that dies for some reason, the other 8 will take you back. There's another rather less nice thought, but it is a very practical one, that is that if you got into real trouble, you can always eat a dog. You can't eat a tractor, and you can't pat a tractor. Or well, you can, it doesn't do much good.
Fuchs advised Hillary to return to base when depot laying duties were completed. But Hillary had other ideas. He had sufficient fuel to have a shot at the pole, and no one had made the journey since Scott 45 years earlier.
It wasn't in the original plan, of course, for us to go to the pole. But I constantly, when we were planning things in New Zealand, brought in a little extra bit of supplies, allocated extra amount of fuel. I didn't discuss it with anybody. That was my responsibility, I felt. And so that when we were set to go, we did have that extra 20 drums of fuel. We had the extra food and everything, so that it was possible to put in a thrust towards the pole.
Hillary reached the pole on the 3rd of January. Fuchs arrived 2 weeks later, and with the route to the Ross Sea mapped, he successfully completed the first ever Antarctic crossing. Journey's End was New Zealand's Scott base, and 37 years later, the two explorers again stood on the same spot.
You know, Bunny, there was a time on during the crossing that I didn't think you were going to make it.
Yes, I realised that. But then after all, you had reason, I suppose, because after all, you'd gone a long way up there and got to the pole and so on, and we were being rather slow, weren't we? There were problems.
However, you did get across here in just 100 days or so that you had forecast.
Yeah, well, we've actually 99. You
99,
know? That's
right.
even better, isn't it?
You saved the
right,
day.
yeah.
Right.
Well, we were glad to get here, and of course, I know you were a bit anxious about the Endeavour was waiting here to take us away, and
I wasn't too enthusiastic about having another winter down here.
Yes.
1957 marked the end of the age of polar personalities and the beginning of a unique spirit of cooperation between nations. In that year, 40 bases were erected for the scientists who were to greatly increase Antarctic discovery.
From the White House, an announcement and a beginning. President Eisenhower heralds man's most concerted effort to learn about the place where he lives. 64 nations are cooperating in the unprecedented undertaking.
July 1st marks the beginning of one of the great scientific adventures of our time, the International Geophysical Year.
International Geophysical Year in Antarctica saw scientists from 12 nations working together on wide-ranging projects. They established bases in each other's territories, shared experiments and results. Together, They advanced Antarctic knowledge. It was this year of science that triggered the cooperation between nations, and it also had far-reaching effects in politics. It led to the drafting of a treaty unique in world politics. The Antarctic Treaty, ratified in 1961, states that Antarctica is to be used for peaceful purposes only. Scientific observations are to be freely available to all nations, and scientific personnel are to be exchanged. This extraordinary document, spawned by scientists rather than by politicians, has survived for more than 30 years to advance Antarctic knowledge across its frontiers. Beneath Antarctica's frozen seas, life abounds. Divers have discovered species as weird as any from a distant planet. An array of chemicals from sponges have been isolated to help fight against human diseases. The ice is a silent indicator of our planet's health. And just as deep cores give a perfect weather report from many thousands of years ago, so Antarctic rocks fascinate us and give us clues to our planet's distant past. But the atmosphere above Antarctica has offered the greatest insight and perhaps sounds the greatest warnings for our future. Each spring, a hole in the ozone layer opens, letting in harmful ultraviolet rays. But all these years of scientific activity have caused their problems. Apart from physical removal, there is no other way of disposing of the refuse that accumulates near bases. The problem has been reported by a new generation of Antarctic discoverers. In 1994, for the first time, the number of Antarctic tourists exceeded the number of scientists. The late Lars-Erik Lindblad safely brought tourists to Antarctica for 25 years. He believed that tourists will help protect its environment.
Without the tourists, we wouldn't have a single national park in the world. Without the tourists, we would have eaten all the zebras in Africa. You know, they would have killed all the elephants for their ivory. Every rhino, they have been trying to do it, but still, the tourists have gotten that stopped. And it is the same. Antarctica is not special in this case. The tourist is going to protect Antarctica and make sure that this doesn't happen.
Most tourist activity takes place on the Antarctic Peninsula. Environmental impact is certainly less from shipborne visitors, but tourists can already fly in to a Chilean hostel on the Antarctic Peninsula. Further land-based tourism will raise issues of energy use and waste disposal. But the issue of sovereignty may be even more important to Antarctica's future. Argentinian children have been born on the continent to support territorial claims. As more and more nations become treaty members, perhaps territorial claims are inappropriate. Already, the idea that Antarctica should belong to the world has received wide support.
I'm one of those who believes the Antarctic should be a world park. But I do believe that if hotels, permanent establishments for tourism were put in, then it could be the beginning of the end for the Antarctic.
The thing that I would like to see go with a world park idea is any territorial claims. And I don't believe if one could have a sort of motif of world park, I think some countries might forget about their territorial claims as long as there was no commercial interest.
Commercial interest brought the first discoverers to Antarctica. A century later, all commercial activity is on hold. Treaty nations have recently imposed a 50-year moratorium on extraction of oil and minerals. Seals and whales have been the longest sufferers of commercial exploitation. But a recent Southern Oceans treaty means they're free to roam for all time in Antarctic waters. This icebound continent offers the world unique gifts. A very special one of breathtaking beauty is the unspoilt environment. Discovery of the patterns of nature and powerful cycles of energy and climate that drive this magnificent and terrifying continent binds nations together in a unique spirit of cooperation. But perhaps the greatest gift that Antarctica offers the world in this, the most hostile of places, is the gift of peace.